What happens when a ceasefire looks like peace on the surface, but behind the scenes the pressure is still building? That is exactly the question the world is asking right now about Iran. Because while headlines may suggest the situation has cooled, the reality is far more dangerous. President Donald Trump has extended a ceasefire with Iran, called off strikes on the country's energy facilities, and delayed Vice President J.D. Vance's trip to Islamabad for direct negotiations. But at the same time, there are signs of deep disagreement inside Iran's leadership, a continuing U.S. blockade on Iranian ports and vessels, and a political standoff that is far from over. And just one day later, the tone from Washington turned even sharper. Trump described Iran's government as fractured and kept the U.S. military on standby, signaling that the White House is not treating this as a finished crisis. So the real story today is not whether the war is over. The real story is whether this is a pause, a pressure test, or the opening move in a much bigger geopolitical confrontation. What is happening now? Let's break this down in simple terms. First, the ceasefire. On paper, that sounds like a step toward de-escalation. But ceasefires in geopolitics are not the same as peace. They are often temporary pauses that allow both sides to reposition, negotiate, or calculate their next move. In this case, the U.S. has not fully backed away. It has paused strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, but the broader pressure campaign is still in motion. Second, the blockade. The reports say the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports and vessels continues. That matters because it means economic pressure is still being used as a weapon. In geopolitics, blockades are more than just shipping restrictions. They are signals. They tell the other side, we still control the tempo of this conflict. Third, the internal split inside Iran. The report highlights disagreement within the Iranian leadership over how to respond to Washington. That is a major detail because a divided leadership is often a weakened leadership. And when a country's top decision makers are not aligned, every external crisis becomes more dangerous. Why this matters? This story is bigger than Iran alone. Iran sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, the energy market, global shipping routes, and U.S. strategic interests. Any escalation involving Iran can ripple outward into oil prices, regional security, investor confidence, and alliances across the Middle East. That is why every statement from Washington and every move in Tehran gets watched so closely. The reason markets and governments care is simple. Geopolitical risk does not stay local. Conflicts in one region can disrupt supply chains, push up inflation, unsettle energy markets, and increase security tensions far beyond the conflict zone. If the situation worsens, the impact may not just be political. It could be economic, military, and humanitarian all at once. And for a global audience, this is exactly the kind of story that matters. It is not just about one country threatening another. It is about how fragile the international system becomes when major powers are locked in confrontation. Trump's strategy. Now let's talk about the U.S. approach. Trump's move to extend the ceasefire while keeping military pressure in place suggests a classic dual-track strategy. Talk and pressure at the same time. That can be effective because it keeps the other side uncertain. Iran does not know whether the next step is diplomacy or escalation, but there is also a risk. If Washington appears too aggressive, it can strengthen hardliners inside Iran who argue that the U.S. cannot be trusted. If Washington appears too soft, it can look like it has lost leverage. That is the tightrope every American administration walks when dealing with Iran. And that is why the phrase fractured government matters so much. Trump is not only criticizing Iran's leadership, he is framing the country as unstable and divided. That kind of language is designed to put psychological pressure on the regime while also signaling confidence to allies and deterrence to adversaries. In other words, this is not just military or diplomatic messaging. It is strategic messaging. Iran est position. From Iran's side, the situation is equally complicated. The report says there is disagreement inside the leadership over how to respond. That could mean factions favoring retaliation, others favoring negotiation, and still others trying to avoid any move that would trigger a larger American response. That kind of internal tension makes decision-making slower and more dangerous. When governments are under pressure, they often face a choice between national pride and national survival. Respond too strongly, and you risk a devastating response. Respond too weakly, and you may lose credibility at home and abroad. That is the trap Iran is in right now. And because the U.S. blockade continues, Iran is under both military and economic strain. That combination can increase domestic pressure, especially if the crisis begins affecting trade, fuel, or public confidence. The broader global impact. Now let's zoom out. If this crisis deepens, it could touch almost every part of the global system. Energy markets are the first obvious channel, since Iran is tied to regional oil and shipping security. The second is diplomacy, because other regional powers will be forced to take sides, or at least hedge their positions. Then there is the China and Russia angle. In a world already shaped by geopolitical fragmentation, major crises tend to pull in outside powers looking to gain leverage, protect interests, or weaken U.S. influence. That means a U.S. Iran standoff is never just bilateral. It can become part of a much wider struggle over influence, trade routes, and security architecture. And for viewers in the United States, this also hits close to home. Higher energy costs, military commitments, and global instability eventually show up in domestic politics. That is why foreign policy stories are never really foreign for long. What to watch next? There are 5 key things to watch in the next phase of this story. Will the ceasefire hold, or will it collapse under pressure? Will the U.S. keep targeting Iranian economic and energy assets, or shift toward negotiation? Can Iran's leadership present a unified response, or will internal divisions deepen? Will regional partners get pulled into the conflict through shipping, intelligence, or military support? Will oil, transport, and market fears begin pricing in a longer crisis? Each of these signals tells us whether this is a temporary standoff or the start of something much larger. So where does this leave us? Right now, the Iran crisis looks less like a finished chapter and more like a suspended one. The ceasefire creates the appearance of calm, but the blockade, the military posture, and the political split inside Iran all suggest that the core conflict remains unresolved. That is what makes this story so important. It is not only about missiles, diplomacy, or presidential statements. It is about the balance of power in a region that can influence energy prices, global security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. And if history has taught us anything, it is this. When major powers say they want peace but prepare for war, the world should pay very close attention.